Decoding Antisemitism After the 7th of October, the Linguistic Angle. Can linguistics help uncover inverted meanings and intentions that reclaim antisemitism in the discursive space? The seminar will revolve around Yaron Matras' contribution, It's All About Context, Antisemitism in the Discursive Space post-7th of October, in the collection Responses to 7th of October Anti-Semitic Discourse. Yaron Matras is Associated Fellow of LCSCA and former Professor of Linguistics at the University of Manchester. He is now Guest Professor at the University of Hamburg and has honorary academic affiliations with the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics in Birmingham and the Department of Hebrew Language at the University of Haifa. John Aziz is a British Palestinian born in the UK with roots in the West Bank. He is a peace activist, writer, and analyst of politics and history. He holds a bachelor's degree in data science. John has written of his vision for peace, compassion, empathy, and humanitarianism between Israelis and Palestinians in various publications, including The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, Prospect, Quillette, and The Dispatch. The discussion was chaired by Beverly Brown, editor of Glasshouse Press.
Yaron Matras is a linguist who focuses on the dynamic aspects of speech at the social level, including multilingualism and especially contact linguistics, that is, languages and interaction with each other. This is explored very much in his current book, published in 2024 by Cambridge University Press, called Speech in the City. And with the subtitle, I can't read my own writing, multilinguistics.
Lingualism, decoloniality.
Multilingualism, I beg your pardon. Decolonicity and civic university, and the civic university. Indeed, his work also explores minority languages, notably Kurdish and Romani. Currently, Yaron holds a variety of positions. He's the honorary professor in the Aston Institute of Forensic Linguistics at the University of Birmingham, similarly in the Department of Hebrew Language at the University of Haifa. Currently, he's in Hamburg in the Institute of Asian and African Studies, where he spent the past year as a guest professor and where he continues to hold a research post. And since 2023, he has been an associate fellow of the Centre, the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. Our second speaker or conversationalist or participant in dialogue is John Aziz, describing himself as a British Palestinian musician, a peace activist, and an analyst of Middle East politics and history. John writes on a regular basis for The Atlantic, The Dispatch, Foreign Policy, The Jewish Chronicle, Quillette, and Prospect UK. His stance is seen as unusual in two respects, as people who follow his Twitter account will be aware. As a Palestinian peace activist, he at the same time shares many, if not all, of the goals and stances as Zionist Israeli peace activists. And secondly, as a Palestinian, he sees he has a special responsibility to be critical of positions and stances offered on the Palestinian side, that he feels an obligation to give a critical interrogation. So here you have the two people who are going to engage tonight. What brings them together? One thing, it's true, in fact, that both of them can claim Palestinian heritage. John, as is well known, and describes in this. My father was one of 10 siblings from a rural village in the West Bank. As a 6-year-old, he hid with his family in a cave during the Six-Day War, the start of 16 years spent under military occupation. That's John's father. Yaron, in a rather different way, and by reference to his grandfather, who was a citizen of Palestine, I should say, under the 1925 Palestinian citizenship order, under the mandate. He has his grandfather's certificate on his website. However, the focus today is really linguistic, the linguistic angle, as it says in Decoding Antisemitism. This is therefore very much part of Yaron's professional linguistic expertise and something that he develops in his books and his writing, looking at forms of speech that can be analyzed here in this setting as anti-Semitic. Some of you may have read his chapter in one of the volumes on September of October put out by the London Centre. This is in the volume on anti-Semitic discourse, and his essay.
I think we've lost Beverly's audio.
Beverly's cut out, yes.
Beverly is on mute. If you can just unmute yourself. She's still on mute.
Apologies.
Okay.
How far back should I go?
About 25, 30 seconds.
A second. You were going to say minutes. Okay, I was just pointing out that if you want to read many of the arguments that are going to be explored here, it's in Yaron's chapter in the responses to the 7th of October anti-Semitic discourse put out by the Centre. It's all about context, and context is a key theme today. Similarly, anyone familiar with John's work will know that the how of argumentation, perhaps even more or equally with the what is that is said, the content, is embedded in his spirited engagements. Sometimes it's true in a pessimistic way, in which he is described as saying that the rhetoric between Palestinians and Israelis during the war in Gaza is becoming irreconcilable. So these clashes and how this comes about is what we're looking at today, focusing on the issue of anti-Semitism, but I'm sure some of these concepts will have wider application. So, as I said, we're going to have 2 rounds, Yaron, John, and the first round is focusing on the significance of context. Yaron.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I know we've just had some sound problems with Beverly's microphone, so I'll keep half an eye on the chat, and if you can just let me know, both positive, negative, if I'm coming through okay, and if not, we'll need to do something about it. So please, somebody just give me a quick yes or a no. Yes for yes, we can hear you. No, it's difficult. And thank you very much. Sound is fine. Beverly, thank you for introducing us. I think you forgot to introduce yourself, so thank you for being here to moderate this discussion. Beverly Brown is a professor of law and publisher, and also associated with the activities of the London Centre, and we've done an event before in the series, so thanks again for introducing us. And the chapter that I will be basing much of what I'm going to say today, called It's All About Context, Antisemitism in the Discursive Space following 7th of October. That chapter is also accessible on my personal website. Just look for my name. I think I'm the only person on the internet still with my name. So you can easily find my website. There's a tab there, Publications, and then you can get to that. So the first round is about context, and the title of my chapter, It's All About Context, is not a complete coincidence. Some of you will recognize the controversy around the answer, "It depends on the context," from some months ago in the US congressional hearing with three university presidents late last year in early December. And I'll come back to that at the end of this first round in a moment. I'll tell you what I don't really want to discuss today, but that's just me. I'm not interested in a discussion, is anti-Zionism always anti-Semitism? That's not what I would like to present. What I would like to present is, how do we approach the scrutiny and the forensic analysis of anti-Semitism as a discursive ideology? We can easily recognize anti-Semitism when it appears in the form of violence directed at Jews. There is discrimination against Jews that can be contested and less easily recognizable. For example, and just to cite one example, in the UK and elsewhere, already 20 years ago, the unions of academic staff were calling for a boycott of Israeli academia, and some people regarded that as discriminatory. It went to the courts at some point in England, where the courts decided that it wasn't discriminatory. So discrimination even can be contested. And even more contested is anti-Semitism as a discursive phenomenon, but anti-Semitism is an ideology. Before it leads to violence, before it leads to discrimination, it's an ideology, and an ideology can be what people think in their inner minds, but we don't know that necessarily until it's articulated. When it's articulated, it takes on a discursive form. And my point today is, and in the article and in this conversation today, is that we need a method to confront it. We need a method to uncover discursive anti-Semitism, to identify it, to understand it, to expose it, and in that way to counter it. So we need basically a methodical approach to discursive anti-Semitism. And that method is one of analyzing statements anchored in what linguists do in certain areas of linguistics, analyzing statement. Now, anti-Semitic intent is often, or perhaps more often than not conveyed overtly. And yet we often feel that there is an anti-Semitic tone and anti-Semitic intent, but it's very difficult often to convey that feeling when we are faced with procedures that try to identify anti-Semitism as an institutional offense, be it disciplinary hearings of various kinds, court hearings, and so on. So how do we analyze discursive anti-Semitism forensically? And my point in this first round of the conversation is that the dependency on context is actually essential. It was mocked in the context of the hearing, the congressional hearing with the university presidents. It was criticized, but it is essential. So we need a method of contextualization, which also applies to decontextualization. So things can also be deliberately taken out of their context and manipulated, and that too can have an anti-Semitic reading. Now, what is context? Context is complex. There are different definitions, but broadly in the study of linguistics within the subfield of linguistic pragmatics, so how we organize conversation basically, we think of context as the knowledge that participants bring with them to the communicative interaction. In other words, a communicative interaction, when we talk or write, it's not in a vacuum. You know, we all bring certain knowledge, certain ideas, certain predispositions to the table. And those predispositions may or may not be overtly verbalized. So for example, elements of the situation can be part of the context, the temporal setting. You know, what I say today, this afternoon, is not necessarily identical, or it can shape the fact that we have a temporal setting, as I'll illustrate in a moment, around us, can have a bearing on the content and the interpretation of what I'm saying. Imagery, we communicate now more often than not through social media, banners and demonstrations and so on in a way that is multimodal. So images accompany words, and the images are therefore an essential component in interpreting what the words mean. The text or the words that precede the utterance or the statement in question. So what I've just said before, or what somebody else said, and I'm reacting to that, that's kind of the context in the everyday sense of the word. and also some general knowledge that interlocutors share, what we call in linguistics the presupposition, so what we can assume that everybody knows and agrees on. So let me give a couple of examples that are in the text, in the article. And the first two are from Twitter, or three of them are, the first three are from Twitter. And I'm relating to a tweet by a human rights lawyer based in London by the name of Qais Sadiki. He's somebody who represents asylum seekers. And I have to say that I had worked with him for several years on and off. I do some work in forensic linguistics around, I won't go into detail, but around language analysis in support of asylum seekers. So we had some good experience working together. I did some kind of expert reports for some of his cases, and his cases won in appeal on the court. So we had a good relationship. On the afternoon of the 7th of October last year, as reports were coming in about the massacre, he posted on Twitter, and I'm quoting, "I stand with the oppressed, not the oppressors," end of quote. And the post included an image of a Palestinian flag and the words, "I stand with Palestine," which were part of that image of the flag. Now, arguably, standing with the oppressed and not the oppressors is uncontested, or at least widely uncontested. And for me personally, standing with Palestine is also uncontested. But my point is that tweeting that without any other evaluation or comment on the events of the afternoon of the 7th of October is making a statement that is inherently anti-Jewish here and hostile to the victims. Sarah Ahmad is a well-known author. She wrote about many things, among other things, racism and discrimination and sexism in UK higher education institutions. I found her work, her published work, very inspiring. I cite it and quote it extensively in my latest book that came out just a couple of months ago. And also in the afternoon at 2 p.m. on the 7th of October, she also sent out a tweet, and there was with a quote from Frantz Fanon, and the quote is, "When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe." And to that quote, she added, "Solidarity with Palestine today and every day." Once again, a part of it that is perhaps non-contested, in any way a quote from something else, but saying specifically revolt, referring to the revolt, is obviously in that temporal setting an analogy or a connection to the Hamas attack, which is seen as a revolt, and in the context, framed within Fanon, a post-colonial revolt that is justified because it's against oppression. And then the emphasis, solidarity with Palestine today and every day, means actually, regardless of whatever the horrors are that we're hearing about, that solidarity remains. So she's clearly taking side with the attackers and not with their victims. And another tweet back to the same lawyer, Qais Sadiki, from a few days later, the 15th of October last year, he publishes an image from an interview that was published in the Times of Israel with Lord Rothschild. And there's a quote that is attributed to Lord Rothschild in that image: "My family created Israel." Now, I haven't, with a photo of Lord Rothschild, I haven't checked the source, so I'm assuming that the quote was in one way or another accurate. And then to that, Sadiki adds the word "surprise, surprise," along with an emoji of now I'm going to quote the definition from the emoji indexed: "Unamused face with rolling eyes." And you may recognize that, or if not, just make a note: "Unamused face with rolling eyes." You can look it up. There is a dictionary of emojis. And obviously the intention of that is to express irony. What is irony? Irony is some kind of exploitation of an opposition to convey distance or humor. And the allusion here is to this general association of Jews with finance and international power, and the idea that they back Israel from that particular position. And the irony is there to contest that, what is well known is not overtly acknowledged. So basically, surprise, surprise, it means subverting these connections between international finance and Israel is portrayed as a subversive act, as a courageous act by the person who is uncovering here. And so what he's contesting is not actually the stereotype of associating Jews with finance. It's the perception that that association is actually true, but not allowed to be overtly articulated. So I call this, in the article, he's basically reclaiming anti-Semitic space. He's suggesting that anti-Semitic tropes are established facts, but they're being randomly denied. And that reproduces the trope itself, because he basically is saying that in a world that is controlled by Jews, one is deprived of the liberty to assert that the world is controlled by Jews. So I'm going to go to my last example for this round, and as promised, back to this US Congress hearing from early December. And if you remember, I'm sure many of you have seen or read videos and passages from that. There were presidents of three universities, of Pennsylvania University, Liz McGill, MIT, Sally Kornblut, and Harvard, Claudine Gay. Two of the three resigned from their positions just a few weeks later. Claudine Gay, allegedly because of an issue of plagiarism that was discovered, but it was all connected somewhat to the hearing, and there were also calls for the resignation of Kornblut. As far as I know, she's still in office. The part that is interesting starts with Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik asking, and I've got the transcript of the whole thing in front of me, and I'm going to read out a few extracts that I find relevant. Stefanik says, will any disciplinary action be taken against students or applicants who say from the river to the sea or intifada advocating for the murder of Jews? Now, this is key for the whole, and this is what creates the context in this particular hearing. So I'll read it again, and it has two parts. Applicants who, or people who say from the river to the sea or intifada. So here she's quoting two things that are uncontested. They have been documented. So people have called, have chanted from the river to the sea, and they've chanted intifada. But then she goes on to say advocating for the murder of Jews. So she then adds her interpretation, which is contested and contestable, that saying intifada and from the river to the sea necessarily advocates the murder of Jews. Or she's attributing, she's saying maybe it doesn't always, but some people do advocate for the murder of Jews. I don't mind telling you that I have been, on occasion, certain versions of From the River to the Sea. I've been around people who chanted it. I can't remember if I actually chanted it myself, but it certainly didn't disturb me. And I certainly wrote in the first Intifada articles and manifestos sympathetic to it. The first Intifada of the late 80s was by and large a civil disobedience, nonviolence by and large. So, these things can mean different things to different people at different times. The response from Harvard President Claudine Gay is, that type of hateful, reckless, offensive speech is personally abhorrent to me. When speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies, including policies against bullying, harassment, or intimidation, we take action. In other words, the answer to the question is yes, we take action against that. Stefanik later picks it up again. She goes, Dr. Gay is calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that violate Harvard's rules on bullying and harassment? So now she's changing. Before she said, she quoted from two chants, from the river to the sea and intifada, two chants that everybody knows were actually articulated. Now she's saying, does calling for the genocide of Jews. So she's offering an interpretation. And still the president says, the rules around bullying and harassment are quite specific, and if the context in which that language is used amounts to bullying and harassment, then we take action against it. So Stefanik goes on, she says, so can you say yes to that question of does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules on bullying and harassment? And Claudine Gay says calling for the genocide of Jews is anti-Semitic. That's toward the beginning of the hearing, and it's, in my view, unequivocal. She, there's a bit of kind of twisting around language, but she basically says yes. Stefanik comes back to the issue later on, and she says now to MIT President Kornblut, yes or no, calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment? And Sally Kornblut, MIT president, says, I have not heard calling for the genocide of Jews on our campus. So basically what is contested is the empirical observation. Stefanik, but you've heard chants for intifada. Kornblut, I've heard chants which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context when calling for the elimination of Jewish people. So arguably they're on the same page here. And then finally, there's one more round, or sorry, that was part of the last round. And then part of that round, Stefanik also turns to Liz McGill, Penn president. Ms. McGill at Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or codes of conduct? And the answer is, if the speech turns into contact, it's harassment. I'm asking specifically, calling for the genocide of Jews, does that constitute bullying and harassment? If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment. So the answer is yes, it is a content-dependent decision. And then finally, back to Dr. Gay at Harvard. She says again, Stefanik, does calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard's rules? She actually answered that already. And then Claudine Gay said, it can be depending on the context. So what's happened here? What's the issue? There's two readings of context here. There's the context of the hearing. The hearing is, of course, a discursive space in itself. Okay, so that it has a context. Within that context, there's a factual body of evidence referred to at the beginning. And that is that there were chants, river to the sea, and intifada. That's factual. Nobody's disputing that those chants were made. All three presidents seem to agree that depending on the context of those chants, they can be a violation of their policies, in which case action would be taken. But what the Congresswoman does is she shifts the question initially from the factual observation of the chants that were made to her interpretation that the chants are necessarily genocidal. That is already contested. That's not factual evidence. Since the interpretation is contested, the presidents go back to the context of the hearing, where there was agreement about the chants river to the sea and intifada, and then they say, well, depending on the context, we decide on those chants, whether they violate our procedures or our policies or not. And then the responses were then widely in the press cited and read as anti-Semitic. My point is to conclude that context interpretation can reveal both what is and what is not anti-Semitic. I'll hand over to John now.
Well, thank you very much, Yaron. That was a very interesting introduction to the topic. Obviously, I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. The reason why I have become a kind of public opponent of anti-Semitism is because of the corrosive effects that anti-Semitism has had in the societies I'm a part of, both the UK as well as Palestinian society. Large parts of narratives hostile to Israel, serving to exacerbate and perpetuate the conflict, are rooted in anti-Semitism. For example, the false notion that Israeli Jews are not related to ancient Jews who are native to the land, but instead are imposters from somewhere else. That's just one example. And I think that these sorts of ideas make it harder for Palestinians to reach a point where they'd be willing to compromise and make a peace deal with Israel. So this is kind of the background that I'm approaching this problem from. Anti-Semitism, like all forms of prejudice, does not always come in the form of explicit attacks, as Yaron discussed. It can be more insidious, embedded in language and symbols, and even in seemingly well-meaning critiques. The challenge, therefore, lies in decoding intent. A statement might seem neutral or even factual on the surface, but its underlying purpose is what we need to examine closely. We have to ask, what is the speaker trying to achieve? Illocutionary acts, which are linguistic expressions that carry out actions, can be particularly dangerous in this context. For example, someone might say, I stand with the oppressed, this is the example Yaron was using, which on its own is a positive sentiment. But if this statement is made in the immediate aftermath of an attack on Jews, or without acknowledging Jewish suffering, it can carry an implicit intent to marginalize or downplay Jewish pain. The illocutionary intent here is not just solidarity with one group, but the exclusion of empathy for another. It creates a discursive space where anti-Semitic ideas can be advanced without ever being directly articulated. Another example is the coded language often used to mask anti-Semitic beliefs. Instead of saying Jews control the world, a person might talk about quote unquote global elites or powerful financiers, knowing full well these terms activate harmful stereotypes about Jews. The intent behind this kind of language is to tap into historical prejudices while avoiding direct accusations. Understanding this requires us to carefully decode intent and to look beyond the words themselves to what the speaker or writer is trying to accomplish socially or politically. So in this part of the fight against anti-Semitism, we need to condemn not only explicit hate, but to recognize how intent can be obscured. The goal is often should be to unmask the purpose behind the seemingly innocuous or neutral statements and to understand how they can signal exclusion, hatred, or violence, specifically towards Jewish people. I suppose that the second part of this is the ideas themselves, because anti-Semitic tropes continue to appear and reappear across generations, often cloaked in new guises. And being able to understand this and being able to understand the context means being able to understand and unpack the ideas themselves. So one of the obviously the most persistent idea is the idea that Jews wield disproportionate power over finance, media, politics. This was, widespread in pre-Holocaust Europe. It was kind of presented as a grand Jewish conspiracy to control the world. Today, we might hear it in more subtle forms. So we might hear about Zionist control or the role of Jewish individuals in global finance. And the shift in language, it might seem like a distinction, but the underlying idea remains the same, which would be the age-old claim that Jews secretly pull the strings of power, exploiting others for their own gain. Another troubling idea that keeps resurfacing would be the portrayal of Jews as kind of eternal outsiders, people who do not truly belong. Historically, this was the rationale for excluding Jews from political and social life in Europe. Today, we hear echoes of this in accusations, for example, that Jews are not, particularly those in Israel, are settler colonialists or not indigenous. So while these critiques, they might often focus on Israeli policies, they sometimes veer into broad generalizations about Jewish people as a whole, as a people, stripping away their historical and emotional ties to Israel. So it denies the complexity of Jewish identity and history, turning Jews once again into perpetual outsiders. In recent discourse, terms like a Zionist, for example, have been weaponized not as a critique of specific policies or anything in particular, but as a stand-in for Jewish in a way that vilifies Jews globally. So if you see phrases like Zionist March or Crush Zionism, it's not necessarily about Israel. So these statements, while seemingly about political ideology, often carry a weight of kind of anti-Semitic sentiments. The intent, again, would be to demonize Jewish people under the guise of political critique. We also see that the resurgence of ideas like of Jews being responsible for their own suffering, which would be kind of blaming Jewish people for October the 7th, for example. In social media conversations, when Jewish people speak about anti-Semitism, they are often met with deflection, as if their experiences are exaggerated or irrelevant. This, I would say, minimizes real harm, and as if anti-Semitism is a problem of the past rather than a problem of the present. And a problem of the present that's continuously evolving and re-evolving and changing and shifting to fit the circumstances. So these ideas tap into centuries of anti-Semitic thinking, and they're often recast to seem more acceptable in modern discourse. But we have to remember that they're fundamentally the same. We're dealing with fundamentally the same age-old hatred, and this is being weaponized in the context of the Palestinian people. It's being weaponized across the West and in places like the UK, where I live. And I think it's a pernicious and dangerous trend that we need to get a handle upon. I think am I handing back to Beverly, or are we going back to your own?
Well, that's round one, as I understand it, between the two of you, and now is round two, which I believe is going to focus more on illocution. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, John just introduced already the term illocution, so thank you for that, and I'll pick up on that. So illocution, just to reiterate, is the we would define it as kind of the desired effect of a statement on the receiver, rather than the action itself. It's a bit confusing because we have illocution, we also have the concept of perlocution. And perlocution is a statement that actually creates a reality. So if you say, I pronounce you man and husband and wife, whatever it is, then, that actually creates a new reality if you have the authority to do that, and so on. So that's the perlocution. But illocution, let's kind of stick with that, is just any effect that the statement will have on the receiver. For example, a typical effect is conveying information. So, by telling your receiver something, you're extending their knowledge. Or eliciting information. If you're asking a question, you want to elicit. So that's the desired effect. You can instigate an action by prompting somebody to do something, or you can create an emotive identification and so on. And in linguistic pragmatics, we've got a whole apparatus of analysis where we can take, things that are said. And important reference work from the 1960s is how to do things with words. So the idea that the words that we use, they have certain effects. Okay, I'm introducing the concept of illocutionary inversion here. And what I mean by that is that a statement, an utterance, a text portion purports to have a certain illocution. Usually what it pretends to have is an assertive illocution. So again, one that conveys information or categorizes information into a certain category by assessing it. But in fact, although it purports to be assertive in the sense that it makes an assertion, it actually flags something else, usually an emotive stance. So rather than saying this is my description of the facts or how I categorize the facts, it actually says this is where I stand in the debate or in the conflict. And what that means, and it might seem initially as a subtle difference, and I'll give an example in a moment and show how it isn't necessarily. It means that the category that you are purporting to be asserting is not really open to scrutiny. It cannot be verified. Because if you say, I feel, this is how I feel, that cannot be verified. We have to take your word for it. And it cannot be contested either because it's subjective. That's how you feel. But if you say, this is the category X, then normally by our normal rules of discourse interaction, that's something that can be contested and is open to scrutiny because we should know basically what are the criteria according to which we categorize things. What are the indicators? So that means that, in fact, the assertion is not information, but it is a bias, something that is not open to scrutiny. So let me give you an example, another one from the chapter. This is another tweet from a person called Sami Pinalbashi. I'm not sure he might go by his English pronunciation. It's a Turkish name, Pinalbaşı, but I think he goes by Pinarbasi or whatever in English. So he was a lecturer in history at the University of Manchester, a place that I worked at for 25 long years. And on the 9th of November of all dates, 23, there were a series of tweets, including one that said, produced an image of masked Al-Qassam brigade members. And he says, these are my new spokespersons. So he didn't leave much room for interpretation for where his sympathies, whether he was just being provocative. I don't know whether, technically, I think that's actually even a criminal offense in the UK. I don't know what happened to him because of that or not. But there was a series of tweets that I want to focus on in November last year, where he was mocking the condemnation of Hamas or the demand to condemn Hamas. And what he did in a series of tweets, he reproduced images of either historical or sometimes fictitious torture victims. So people, I'm not going to go into details, and if you have access to Twitter, you can probably find this, and the URLs are cited in the footnotes to my article online. So you can view it if you're interested, if it's still there. So he depicts kind of torture victims, torture instruments, electrocution, medieval crucifixions, that kind of stuff. And to each of those images, which he took from various sources, I guess, published online, I don't know, it wasn't images that he created as far as I could tell. So he took them from somewhere. He added a recurring message, do you condemn Hamas, with quotation marks and a question mark. So here he uses the imagery to create a context. So we're back to context. It portrays kind of settings where there's a vile power that exerts torturous pressure on an innocent party in order to extract a confession. So that's already the context that he's creating. And the analogy is to Israel and its supporters are an entity that resort to kind of blackmail and pressure to extract sympathy. Where's the illocutionary inversion? Well, he's presenting a phrase as a question. Do you condemn Hamas? Citing the question that is being asked of, at that point in time, various politicians, spokespersons who come out by that point, condemning Israel for its retaliatory invasion or attacks in Gaza. And we're often asked in the media, do you also condemn Hamas? And he's making a caricature of that. But it's a question, but actually by the mentioning Hamas, he's transposing that fictitious, torturous setting into the context of the contemporary debate, obviously. But the question, what is supposedly a question, becomes in effect a declaration of his own stance. So it's not really a question, certainly not cited from somewhere fictitious, but it's his position to say he's critical of condemning Hamas or the attempt to get others to condemn Hamas. So he's critical of the expression of sympathy with Israeli victims. So just a subcategory of that illocutionary inversion is what is, I'm coming back now to context and to the decontextualization. So this is the inversion again of a knowledge category assertion as what you might call an emotive judgmental rant, one that cannot be verified and cannot be contested. So once again, categories of knowledge purport to be based on a kind of a compilation of indicators and features that always co-occur. So we talk about something like an autocracy, and we have an understanding that there are certain features that characterize an autocracy. And so if we categorize a setting as an autocracy, then we expect those features that are understood to define the category to be present in that setting. And different co-occurrences of features allow us to identify different categories and arrive as a taxonomy. In fact, this is basically the ABC of the legacy of the Enlightenment. Western knowledge, Western epistemology all rests on taxonomies and categorizations based on indicators and features that can be assembled and reassembled, analyzed and attributed to different categories. So that's kind of essential in our everyday, at least kind of Western concept of dealing with what is knowledge and what is science and what is argumentation. And of course, for all of those symbols, there's often a prototype. So certainly if we use the kind of the category apartheid, then there is historical South Africa is a prototype. White settler colonialism, we have prototypes, whether it's the Americas, Southern Africa, North Africa, a variety, but we know what the prototype is. So applied wholesale to situations where the category is not applicable instead is actually canceling the fact that we have a spread of features that may or may not all be coherent and consolidate a particular category. So let me just, to illustrate, give a couple of categories and a kind of examples, and then I'll hand back to John. And the first one is, of course, Zionist. And Zionist has become a kind of a signifier that we don't even know what it really means I mean, many people do, of course, you know, analytically or define themselves as Zionist, and they will know, but I'm talking about kind of in this discourse, and especially the critical, the hostile discourse to Israel, we've kind of lost track of what Zionist means. And just to give you a couple of examples, again, November last year, you remember the deal with Hamas in a couple of parts where some prisoners, some hostages were released. And there were tweets kind of on social media and others, the Zionist prisoners who were released. What does that mean as an attribute? It means they were released for what? Because, I mean, they had particular points of view. They were members of a particular political movement or not. You know, people were taken hostage at random. People who were, you know, foreign workers from Thailand, Bedouins, with Israeli citizenship, all sorts of people. So the Zionist prisoners were released. In November, late November, there was a march against anti-Semitism in London. It was described in numerous posts as the Zionist March. And this brings back memories. There was a big 2018, the scandal around, Corbyn's anti-Semitism scandal. And there was a revelation at some point, a video came out where Jeremy Corbyn at a meeting said something about Zionists who lived in Britain all their lives, but lacked the English sense of irony. That was kind of portrayed as, well, he only meant the people who are ideological Zionists, not Jews. However, the Chakrabarti report that people will remember from 2016, so the internal Labour Party report assigned to Shami Chakrabarti to look into allegations of anti-Semitism, called that use of Zionism euphemism. She actually got confused a bit with the term euphemism is usually a placeholder for a word that causes offense. And what she meant, what was in the back of her mind, is that basically he wanted to say Jews. It was very revealing, actually. Jew, but Jew would cause offense. So instead of Jew, he said Zionist. And she actually recommended not to use Zionist as what she called euphemism. But she confused euphemism with euphemism, and that's kind of beside the point, but it's still revealing. So the point is, this general use of Zionist is taking us back to what? It's decontextualizing it from what it has been in the past, let's say, century and a half or so, detached from the appellation, self-portrayal of people and movements as Zionist, or from any objective analysis of what it means. So what are the correlates of somebody defining themselves as Zionist and what they do or don't do, or all the differences between them. And it's taking it back and recontextualizes pre-Holocaust anti-Semitic discourse precisely by serving as a placeholder for Jew. And Jew in pre-Holocaust times is a hate speech item. And we still encounter discomfort with people even talking about Jews. So I lived in Germany for many years. I'm back in Germany now for a while, but before that I was in Germany for many years. And in the 1980s, you'd feel, you'd hear people saying, well, I don't want to use the word Jew because that's a Nazi expression. So people said, people of Jewish heritage, or Jewish people, or Jewish human beings, and stuff like that, just to kind of paraphrase, to avoid saying Jew because they associated Jew with Nazi discourse. And two other examples, which I won't elaborate on because I think they're obvious, but we can come back to in the discussion: apartheid. So this wholesale categorization of Israel as apartheid is in fact a cancellation of the category. Now, I would view apartheid in that sense as a spread of features. I am of the opinion that there are certain features of Israeli rule, law, establishment, whatever you want to call it, that are apartheid-like, more so in the West Bank for various reasons, others in Israel itself, and that one could compare. But I do not think that the term apartheid is wholesale applicable to Israel. And the same with settler colonialism that John mentioned already. Again, there are aspects of Israeli policy which, in my view, without a doubt, remind us and have settler colonialism features. Whether the people are white or not, that's another discussion, but settler colonialism features. But one cannot attribute to Israel wholesale and historically everything, settler colonialism. So, but this is beyond my point here on the discourse level, that this is beyond simplification. And it's not about whether it's correct or incorrect. That's not even my point. We can argue about how much apartheid there is or isn't in Israel. That's not the point. The point is the cancellation of certain discursive categories, that when these things are said, they're said as a rant. They're not even open to scrutiny and discussion. So the people who use apartheid and white settler colonialism and Zionism in that way are not actually inviting scrutiny of the category. They're not open to the argument, which normally categorizations should be open to. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the features. Let's see if they are aligned to form a certain category. They are just rants. And I was asked in some kind of online social media debate, are you a Zionist? And then I replied by saying, well, what do you mean by Zionist? And the person replied, you tell me. I said, well, you asked the question. And then I was canceled because I refused to reveal whether I was or wasn't a Zionist. So you can't really have a discussion about those terms once they're introduced because they are emotive rants rather than categorization. I'll stop here, hand back to John.
Thank you, Yaron. That was a very interesting contribution. I'd like to turn to Jean-Paul Sartre and his essay, Anti-Semite and Jew. And the sort of perspective in that was the idea that the anti-Semites' hatred of Jews is not based on evidence or reason, but it's deeply emotional, and it's kind of an irrational commitment to a worldview. So for the anti-Semite, being against Jews is not about fact, it's about identity. It's a way to define oneself against an imagined other. And when we're talking about the hidden intent behind what people say, much like Sartre's depiction of the anti-Semite, modern anti-Semitism often operates, as Yaron was saying, not through overt attacks, but through these kind of subtle, indirect statements that convey this underlying purpose. And when someone says the term, settler colonialism, when they say the term apartheid, it's not necessarily a rational contribution or an intellectual discussion. It's more about appealing to deep-seated emotional hatred. It's a call to emotion more than a call to action. Unfortunately, I do agree with Yaron that if you want to make a genuine comparison between the government of apartheid South Africa and the government of Israel, there are sometimes you'll be able to find similarities, just as you could between the government, maybe the United States under some circumstances, or the government of Britain. When you compare governments to governments rationally, there are going to be similarities, back and forth. But when people are using these terms, it's not necessarily about making an intellectual argument. It's much more about appealing to emotion, appealing to hatred, and trying to create a situation that's insoluble. As I said in my first contribution, one of the biggest problems that I think we as Palestinians face is people on our own side who want us to believe that the conflict is insoluble and the conflict is never ending, and there's something fundamental that cannot be unpicked between Israelis and Palestinians. And I think that that's a very dangerous position to take. It's a very dangerous thing to believe in, because it puts us into an awful position, really, doesn't it? Because rationally we would think that a conflict like this, where people, if you look at the facts, very obviously both sides have a real attachment to the land and a real history on the land, and we should be able to figure out how to live together, because neither side's going anywhere, neither in narrative terms nor literally physically. Neither side's going anywhere. But unfortunately, my own side's narrative sometimes gets poisoned with these kind of anti-Semitic ideas that take us and keep us bound to this never-ending narrative of conflict that the only way it can end is in total victory or total defeat. I think that's an incredibly dangerous position for us to put ourselves in, to want to be in. And to me, that suggests that we need to try and change the narrative and try and go over to something more compromise oriented, where we can kind of look at things from both sides and look at the humanity on both sides. But there are, as you know, I've really enjoyed working with Yaron and reading his paper and learning about his ideas, because it really gets into how the pernicious danger of this really subtle, irrational, pervasive anti-Semitism. And it destroys societies ultimately, right? I think if you look at Berlin in 1944, 1945, that was an anti-Semitic mania that ended in a horrific war, including the Holocaust, and the terrible destruction in Germany, in German cities. They were swept up in this Hitler-oriented anti-Semitic mania, and it destroyed their own society. If you look at Gaza today, and again, I'm not saying that Gaza is the same as Nazi Germany. That's not. It's not the same. There's different issues at play. There's a religious conflict at play, but Gaza has also been swept up in a kind of anti-Semitic mania, unfortunately, with the rule of Hamas and the kind of anti-Semitic ideas embedded in their ideology, and that has crushed. It's put Gaza into a position where they've been brought into a horrible war, and it's brought incredible, awful, terrible destruction. And when I see anti-Semitic ideas spreading in the United Kingdom, in the United States, that's not a good thing at all. That's a terrible thing, not just for Jewish people, but for the entirety of society, for everyone living here, because these kind of irrational anti-Semitic manias that societies seem to go through from time to time, they're a threat. They're a threat to everyone. They're a threat to everyone's well-being. So it's important to decode what anti-Semitism is. It's important to understand what anti-Semitism is, and it's important to fight against and to defeat anti-Semitism, because nothing good will come from this.
So, would you like to wind up and make any overall statements? Or shall we proceed to open the floor up to questions or comments?
I think we can proceed. What do you think, Yaron?
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of in one phrase basically say again what I said in my introduction, that my point that I was trying to make today is that we need a method to scrutinize discourse, and that the onus is we need a burden of proof, and we cannot just work with our emotions on what is or isn't anti-Semitic discourse. We need tools to be able to prove it. And those tools, as I showed in the first example, well, in the example of the congressional hearing, I think sometimes we call anti-Semitism when, according to the analytical tools, it isn't necessarily. So context can bring us to one conclusion as well as to the other. It can demonstrate why something is anti-Semitic. It can also demonstrate why something is not anti-Semitic that may have been called out as if it were. But again, my interest tonight is in the method of doing that, and the need to do that in a methodical way.
Well, I've got some questions here in the chat. The first is a comment that this last point is key and needs amplification. I think that was referring to John's final point about the effect on the whole of society. Is that right, Susan? Oops, sorry, I have to. Yes, that's correct. So could you say a little bit more? Could you amplify that?
I mean, when Hitler burned the Jews, he didn't just burn the Jews. He burned disabled people. He burned political opponents. He burned the LGBTQ community. You know, this is. I don't want to reduce Jewish people and Jewish suffering to a kind of canary in the coal mine situation. I think that's wrong too. But you know, I've seen I think evidence in studies that people who hold anti-Semitic views are more likely to hold anti-Black views, for example, right? They're more likely to hold racist views generally, even more likely to hold Islamophobic views. So this is a really serious problem for our entire society, and I think there is an incredible danger that a lot of people living in the West could suffer if we get swept up into a terrible anti-Semitic mania like 1930s Germany or like 2005, 2006 Palestine. It's bad. It's dangerous. It's a danger to everyone. It's first and foremost, it's a danger to the Jews, yes, but there's an entire cross section of society that's imperiled by this, which is why I think people who are not Jewish should feel strongly about this and should be willing to try and fight against it and try and put the genie back into the bottle.
But do you think it's wider than that? I'm speaking from the box. Do you think it's not just about multiplying the different prejudices, but an entire anti-democratic frame of mind? Would you go that far?
Yeah,
it's not just one prejudice, another, and another, but
no, it's kind of this totalitarian system, isn't it? There's a system of I guess totalitarian populism that maybe we've seen glimpses of in the last few years. I think we certainly see it in the speeches of, for example, the Ayatollahs in Iran. And in maybe in the speeches of people like Vladimir Putin as well. There is this totalitarianism that is creeping back into our society, and I think anti-Semitism is it's kind of there's this concept called horseshoe theory, where the political spectrum is not a left to right sweep. It's not a left to right line. It's like a horseshoe that bends back on itself, and that right down at the bottom you get Islamism, communism, Nazism, totalitarianism, anti-Semitism. So I think that's true, and I think it's where it's a position that's kind of fundamentally totalitarian and fundamentally racist.
Well, and also, if I can add, if we try and bring it back to the level of analyzing discourse, we've got this odd combination, odd convergence of the post-truth era in autocratic regimes like the ones that you've mentioned, and a certain postmodernist tradition. There's a brilliant analysis of this in Shalom Lapin's recent book about the I think it's called The New Antisemitism. And there's a recording of I believe a seminar in this series, or also a center event from some couple months ago, where he analyzes how the postmodernist notions and the feed into the post-colonial ideology, then becomes populist. And the point here, I again come back to my point of the category inversion, the illocutionary inversion, the pretense that something that is categorizing and is based on knowledge and information is actually emotive and therefore cannot be questioned. And I think that's where we have that common denominator between totalitarianism. It's an Orwellian game, basically, again, where things are put out there as if they are information categories, and if they are truth, but cannot be questioned because actually they're not information-based and not open to scrutiny. And that's where these discursive categories, and that, of course, is general it's not just, it doesn't target just Jews. It's a general problem of how we work with knowledge. Can we have anything that is knowledge and information based guiding our approach to society, to improving society, to running its institutions, to building bridges, or even speaking with other communities and other persons? It basically destroys the whole basis of what is knowledge in communication, and how do we communicate with one another. So much wider than anti-Semitism, or even just of any racism at all.
Yes, but also, this is me speaking now, but I think it links what the questioner was talking about, anti-democratic, with the way in which the sort of communicative presumptions of democracy are what's being undermined here. But anyway, I have two more questions so far. The first one is again for John. I have a question for John, who I have followed and appreciated on Twitter for a long time. Do you think the peace between Israelis and Palestinians is possible unless Palestinian society gets rid of a certain amount of anti-Semitism?
I think one of the great difficulties for Palestinians is that Palestinians are in a conflict with a Jewish state, and I think that how do I have to phrase this very carefully? It's very easy when you're in a real conflict with people, especially people who represent themselves as a Jewish state, to allow hatred to seep into it. And that's not, I'm not, anti-Semitism is terrible and disgusting and awful and the worst thing in the world, but it's been very easy for people who have, horrendous anti-Semitic ideas to propagate them through the real conflict, right? To the question, I would say high fences make good neighbors, and this is probably why I'm more of an advocate for a two-state solution than a one-state solution, because probably there needs to be a degree of separation because of how brutal things have gotten, particularly in Gaza recently, and of course with the terrible events of October the 7th. So I don't think after October the 7th Israelis are going to be particularly willing to welcome Palestinians from Gaza to live side by side with them. Just as after the current events of the war, I'm not sure people in Gaza are going to feel particularly good about Israelis coming. So I think that that's one reason of many why I'm an advocate for a two-state solution. But I think, yes, the anti-Semitism in Palestinian society, albeit that anti-Semitism does originate and is fired by a real conflict, is a real serious issue, and we have to do something to get rid of it. We have to do something to marginalize it, because I think you're pointing to a really serious problem, which is if let's say there's peace tomorrow and we have an agreement, and there's a two-state solution, but if the day after a two-state solution you have people who have anti-Jewish ideologies who still believe that all the people in Israel are not really related to the land, they're all chezars from wherever, and they're going around saying that this land all belongs to us from the river to the sea. We have to take it back. We have to take it back. How long? Until the next October the 7th, right? So this unless you get rid of the source of the hatred and the source of the violence and the conflict, you're not going to solve the conflict. And people on the Palestinian side will say, well, isn't the occupation one of the sources of the conflict? And fine, that's right. You do need to get rid of the occupation as well. But you also, we have to take this seriously, because if you have an ideology that is fueling conflict, that has to be addressed if you want to stop the conflict.
Thank you. Now another question, which I think is to both of you, and it's about the reports on the BBC's anti-Semitism. And it says here, if you're familiar with the Assertions report, but I'm sure the name was Aston, I think it was, wasn't it? And there was also another report as well. Do you have any comments on the methodology? Yes, Aston, thank you. Aston. Comments on the methodology used in the analysis for the report? Have you read the SSA report?
I don't, I'm afraid. I've only read reports about it. I haven't read the
Yeah.
original, so I
Yeah.
can't comment.
John?
I'm furiously Googling it. I haven't actually read
Right,
the report,
okay,
so
well,
I think it's probably safer for me to not comment, but I might be able to comment on Twitter later after I read it.
Okay, good, thank you. Now I've got, oh yes, here's another one. Imagine that before October the 7th, there was a two-state solution and Palestinians were able to cross into Israel from Ramallah. What would the result again? I'm not entirely sure what that means, and also I thought Palestinians could cross over, but anyway. Oh, what would the result be?
I'm afraid first of all, didn't hear everything exactly, so
I beg your pardon.
Anyway, irrespective, I will want to hear it again, but irrespective, I was going to say that I don't like imagine if questions. I can't. I mean, my whole point tonight was speaking as a linguist to introduce again a methodical way of looking at discourse, and that's very much not reconcilable with the imagine if, although in a different kind of conversation. I'm also just because Beverly, I'm not sure if you can see, but there's Becky Azen raising a hand there.
Where is that? Oh, there it is.
Also on the screen. She's on the screen. So after that,
yeah, no,
if you'd like to repeat the question, I'm still interested in hearing it.
Okay, so Becky Azen, I've noted that you've got your hand up, but we're still dealing with this prior question. So imagine that before October the 7th, there was a two-state solution in place, I guess, and Palestinians were able to cross into Israel from Ramallah. What would the result be?
I think to address this, it's important to say that if there was the two-state solution that I imagine, where the extremists in Palestine are marginalized and where there is no longer an occupation, right, a military occupation, and where Palestine is a sovereign state with economic development and an education system that encourages young people to work and to build things and to create things rather than to fight the Jews, I don't think there would be an October the 7th. So that's the vision that I'm going for. I think that societies are changeable, and I think that the ideology of Hamas is not permanent. And I think in a true, just, fair, peaceful two-state solution, the extremists will be so marginalized that the most they could do is a little attack here or there. There wouldn't be October the 7th was a huge operation, right? It was like, I think more than 4,000, 5,000 terrorists, fighters entered Israel from Gaza. So this was a huge coordinated operation with just support from what was effectively the government of Gaza, right? Hamas. So in a true two-state solution, you wouldn't, true to my vision, you wouldn't have Hamas being the government. You wouldn't have, it would be very different. So you wouldn't get another October the 7th. That's my vision, because an attack like this, the only thing ultimately it's going to do is perpetuate the conflict.
Yes. And Yaron?
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't, I mentioned, but my favorite imagine if question, I think, is imagine if Rabin hadn't been assassinated by a Jewish extremist. And the couple of years that I experienced in Israel in the early 90s, which were like, almost a utopia come true with Palestinians and Israelis interacting at all sorts of levels, from children's television to businesses to all sorts of things, would have continued to flourish. But I approached this at several levels. Now we had another question, but I can't see the person.
I know Becky. Is Becky still here? If you are, could you unmute?
Yeah.
No.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Lovely.
Hi. So thanks. Just to start off, thank you all. It's been really, really interesting this evening. And I will be quick because I don't actually have a question. I have an interjection, and I always get frustrated with people in Q&As who like to use it as a soapbox or just to put across an opinion. But I feel like it's related, so I'll be brief. Just when Yaron was talking about the word Jew and how in Germany, they would just sort of try and obfuscate it because the word Jew itself was seen as a pejorative or was linked to something dark and nasty, and how I think the word Jew is considered a pejorative. It has been and historically and in the present. But also specifically, what I wanted to say was about the word Yid, and talking about the word Yid and the context of anti-Semitism, because you might be able to hear that I'm not English. I've been here for 20 years, but I am from Australia and from Melbourne specifically. And Melbourne was the city outside of Tel Aviv, so it was the city that took in the most Holocaust survivors after the war outside of Tel Aviv. So you can imagine that really has shaped the character of the community. So I always say my grandparents were survivors, all of my friends' grandparents were survivors, my grandparents' friends were survivors. So when I was little, I used to think that all old men had numbers on their arms, because all the old men that I knew did. I just thought it was a thing. And then I saw an old Jewish man, non-Jewish man who didn't have one. And I asked my mum, where are Uncle John's numbers? So it shapes the community. But also one of the positives is it's a very Yiddish oriented community. So I grew up secular atheist, but I went to a Yiddish school that was set up by the Bund. Wasn't quite Bundist when I was there in the 80s, but we celebrated Yom Ha'atzmaut. We learnt Hebrew from grade 3, but Yiddish was the main sort of thing. And so to me, the word Yid is just the Yiddish for the word Jew. And so it's a fine word, and it has sort of positive connotations. If you think of sort of old Yiddish songs, Mein Yiddische Mama or Yiddle Mitten Fiddle, or and I actually have two. There are two bands in Australia with Jews, and the one's called Yid, and the other's called Yid Core, and they're both contemporary bands. Yid Core is heavy metal Jewish Yiddish, or more Jewish, and Yid with an exclamation point is actually a fusion band with like klezmer, electronic dance music, jazz. I don't get it myself. But anyway, the point is the word Yid is seen as a positive. And I found it very strange when I got here. And as I said, I've been here 20 years. So I was here for all the debates around the Y word and David Baddiel's documentary and, all the discussion around it. And I get it in the way contextually, again, looking at the context of it. But I must say that the opposition of British Jews to the word Yid is like strange for me. I understand it intellectually, but viscerally, it sort of feels borderline, not anti-Semitic, so I won't go that far, but it feels like it's sort of internalizing something, only because for me, the word is devoid of any negative connotation. It's just the word. It's sort of a fond word for Jew, because I think the Yiddish language is sort of, has lots of diminutives and is quite soft and familiar in a way. So anyway, that was all I wanted to share. So I hope it wasn't irrelevant.
Yeah. No, thank you, Becky. That's very exciting. Melbourne is one of my absolute favorite cities in the world, and it is indeed one of several communities where there are still a large number of Yiddish speakers. Manchester is another, and I think your comments shows again how it's all about context. Now let's play an imagine game after all. And let's imagine that you were being interviewed by a congressional U.S. Congress hearing, and somebody would ask you, is the word Yid offensive? And if you were to say it depends on the context, people would bash you and say you have to resign from your position. And that's kind of a bit of the analogy. It's not a complete one, but it shows, I think, once again, the importance of context. And as I was saying before, in trying to define context, it can be the temporal setting. It can be also the knowledge, what we call the presuppositions or the presupposed knowledge, the particular information that can be very much localized and can be different from place to place. And therefore, what you call the connotation, rightly, can be different. And that again, I think, underlines the importance of having a methodical approach, and one that is highly contextual to analyzing these things in order to establish, can they cause offense? Do they cause offense? How and where? And should they be avoided, or should somebody be penalized if that's the case for using?
Yeah, and I also appreciate what Becky said there. I don't speak Yiddish, I don't speak Hebrew, so I don't really have anything to add above what Yaron said, that it is all about the context, and obviously I agree with that. It's certainly from my perspective, I think you have to ask the people who are affected by it above all else, right? Whether or not something is anti-Semitic, yes, it depends on the context. It also depends on the feelings and the views of the Jewish community, because they're the people who experience anti-Semitism. So I think you have to kind of caveat with that. For example, anti-black rhetoric. Who really gets to decide? Well, there you can have a methodological way of looking at that, but you also probably have to ask the views of the black community, for example. So that I think you have to bring that in. And of course, if a Jewish person personally feels that a word is not offensive to them, then that's one thing. But then if the wider Jewish community does feel it's offensive, then that's quite another.
I'd like to introduce a comparison with anti-Gypsyism, or Romophobia, as it's sometimes called. I worked for many, many years with Romani people. I worked as a linguist on the Romani language for many years. I've written a lot about Romani people, both language and history and culture in general. The term gypsy, we don't want to kind of stray to a completely different topic here, but the word gypsy is one that is used always externally. So traditionally, Rome called themselves Rom in their own language, Romani, but that term is until fairly recently was not even known more widely, and different nations have different terms that they use, whether it's Tzigan or Chigani or Tsigani and so on, to Gitan, Gitanos, to refer to gypsies. But interestingly, where Romani gypsies abandoned their Romani language and adopted the language of the majority population, as is the case in England, where they no longer speak Romani, they speak English, sometimes embedded with some Romani words, they actually refer to themselves as gypsies. So I've never come across a Romani gypsy person in England who thought of the word gypsy as being offensive, and yet in the institutional political discourse, it is often being avoided because it causes offense, and it does cause offense in some contexts and so on. So that's become very, very difficult for policy drafting, even just documents of organizations like the Council of Europe, the European Commission, who tried to draft policies in support of Romani people. What term do we even use to address them? Because different terms mean different things to different population groups. But that means that we're on an ever evolving dynamic process of watching what we do and consulting. And that issue, interestingly, that John just mentioned, you ask a person, are they offended? And if they are, then it's something you need to do something about. That is, I've experienced that in 30 years in living in the UK, so often canceled. When I said in an academic environment, there were things that were anti-Jewish. No, that cannot be, because we are not a racist environment, and because the environment has defined itself as equality and diversity, it cannot be that you interpreted it in that way. And therefore, I was reprimanded. And I'm not going to, I've got a blog post, if you're interested, go online and on my website with some examples. But for years and years, I was again and again told off for addressing issues of anti-Semitism because that offended, that damaged the reputation of people about whom I said that they made anti-Jewish statements, because it cannot be that in our environment we have anti-Jewish statements. And that's, again, there's an Orwellian take on that. There's the newspeak and there's the control, but it's not allowing people who feel offended when it comes to anti-Semitism to address that they feel offended and that something needs to be done about it. A couple of years ago, you may remember the government, I think it was Gavin Williamson, his name was higher education minister, or secretary or whatever, and tried to get universities in the UK to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the working definition, as part of their policies and procedures. There was some resistance. And there were universities that adopted it, but adopted a clause that you need to prove anti-Semitic intent. And that is such an exception, because I'm not aware, in policies and procedures of other forms of harassment, that there is, the onus on the victim or the complainant, first of all, to prove the intent of the other person when they said something that they found offensive. I mean, initially it is at least investigated. in order to establish. And here, basically, there was a clause in a kind of a wholesale denial of the need to investigate if no anti-Semitic intent could be proven. And that's, again, why the contextual analysis is so important, to return to that.
But can I ask a question about context myself? There's nobody else lined up at the moment. I'm not. But does it succeed in closing the meaning to be this meaning and not that meaning? I mean, isn't context itself contested? I say this is the context. You say this is the context. Or in that statement of, I think it was Amnesty that said, oh, it didn't start on the 7th of October. You know, or so there's an invitation to context, but of course it's leaving it open to a whole variety of competing contextualizations, although obviously they didn't think it did. But yeah, so I'm just wondering whether context is really solves the problems. Yeah.
Well, a question that I often received from students when supervising, decades of supervising students in linguistics, when they have, in linguistics, we work quite often with either text or transcriptions of spoken language, and we interpret them, not usually for content, for structures, but what certain structures mean. Do you use the conditional tense where you mean the past tense, and so on and so forth. And what if I'm wrong? How do I know if I'm right? Was often the question. People were in the discourse analysis, was seen as something that it is by definition interpretation. How do I know if my interpretation is correct? Well, you present your data, first of all. They have to be accessible. They have to come under scrutiny. And then you present your method. These are the criteria that I use. And then it is open to be contested. It's open to scrutiny, but that's the beauty of it. That's the part of being a method. It's open to scrutiny, and maybe somebody will come along and offer a different interpretation, but they have to relate to the same set of data, and they have to use the same method. And then if they use the same method and arrive at a different conclusion, then it's fine to argue over it. The problem that we're having now, and that I was presenting, is things are presented as non-contestable. Israel is apartheid. I've heard, if you look at, my Twitter, I've reacted to that, but elsewhere, there are university lecturers, partly an institution that I used to work in, partly people I know, many people that I don't know, but people in academic positions who are sending out messages like, well, if you don't believe that this is apartheid, then I don't want a discussion with you. Or then, go somewhere else or whatever. So they kind of overtly, directly, explicitly shut down the conversation, because it's a matter of belief. Now, I don't have an argument with people who have faith and believe in God. I can't prove them wrong. I don't. I respect their belief, and maybe they respect mine, or they try to convince me or convert me or whatever. But it's not a debate that we can work with factual evidence, and we agree on that by and large. Although sometimes they think there is factual evidence, but at least we here this is a a different thing, and it becomes a metaphysical. There's an article that I'm very fond of from a few years back that deals with the boycott, the arguments for an academic boycott of Israel, and by a linguist, a specialist in philosophy and linguistics, who actually comes to the conclusion that the argument is metaphysical. You can't even, there isn't a factual argument that you can argue with, that you can contest and scrutinize in regard to the academic boycott. You either believe it or you don't believe it, and that's where we have to move away. And that's why I think, yes, it's okay to contest. It's okay if the evidence is contested. If we have a method, then we can debate it, just like we debate things in courts and so on.
Yes, and somebody's pointing out here, in other contexts, which I think she's speaking particularly of debates about trans rights and women's rights, the no debate stance. It's the no debate rhetorical stance we see elsewhere, inherently closed and inherently anti-democratic. I've seen this chalked on pavements as I walked away from conferences. No debate. But
that's a very dangerous stance, isn't it, really? The idea that you can't have a debate about something because something is, beyond contest. Okay, if the evidence is there, right? I think there are certain issues that there's a lot of evidence for a position, but between people who are educated, people who understand the issues, people, you can still, there is still always room for more interpretation and adding a different context, because the context in the most general sense is everything in the rest of the world, right? You've got the text, which is just whatever you're looking at, and then you can get context from anywhere else, and there's layers of context, and there's different I guess different degrees of context. You can the first degree of context would be immediately surrounding it. Then there's context to context. So there's so many different things that you can bring in to interpreting these things, right? It's a complex procedure, but to write off a situation as beyond debate, beyond reproach, I think that's it's not academic. It's not academic because academia is about studying, and it's about trying to disentangle what things mean in every context. You can bring anything. There's so many different layers that you can bring. So I certainly don't like the idea of saying that we can't even have a debate unless you accept this premise.
Yes. So more questions? Either put up the hand or write in the chat space. Cats are also welcome to ask questions.
In the meantime, I'll just say that I am actually in these last couple of days involved in a debate of interpreting something that was said publicly by a politician 2 days ago. The politician concerned is a member of parliament from Manchester, and somebody that I've known for about 20 years and worked with very closely many years around issues of minority rights, issues of multilingualism, and Israel-Palestine. He's a Muslim member of parliament, and a couple of years ago even approached me for some help in formulating a speech for a debate in the UK Parliament about recognizing the state of Palestine. So that's the nature of the relationship. And I was very upset a year ago when he kind of disappeared from the public eye, at least the social media web, in the days after the 7th October. And, the relationship is such that I was able to send a text message and ask, where are you? Why are we not hearing a statement of condemnation or something? Somebody who's very active in commenting on the Middle East normally. And there was a reply that it wasn't convincing to me. In any case, a year on, I basically asked the person, well, will you make a statement now on the anniversary? And a statement was made on the anniversary. I have no idea whether it was prompted by my request or whether there were other prompts or other reasons. And I was very upset by the statement. It said, on the anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israel, in which Israeli and foreign citizens were killed, I condemn the massacres committed by Israel and the escalation that Israel has done to the war into Iran and into Lebanon. So to me, the inevitable interpretation was that he's basically taking a day of commemoration of by and large Israeli victims in an attack that was very clear, explicitly and overtly anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, genocidal. Yes, and the statement went on to also call Israel's actions in Gaza genocide and so on. The only thing that could be interpreted as an expression of sympathy for the Israeli or Jewish victims was the word innocent. It did say an attack on innocent Israelis and foreign citizens. Now, I am debating that not with the author, but with somebody else who's also close to that person and also known him for a period of time. And in the past couple of days, we've been exchanging messages, and we will arrange to meet in the next few days to discuss it face to face. But we understand that we have different interpretations of that statement. It's a written statement. And still, we have been using in our correspondence over the last couple of days tools similar to the ones that I was trying to introduce before. What is the context? What is said before? What is after? What do we know about the person? What is his audience, and so on. And so far, we differ in our opinions, and we'll see. We'll continue the conversation and see if we can resolve it. But I'm saying this because, first of all, it's ongoing. Every week something comes up, at least, or every day that is deserves scrutiny and criticism, perhaps, and so on. Every day some statement comes up, and I'm sorry to say, by people that I've known. I mentioned a couple of examples before. My initial examples were also people that I either read and admired in terms of their academic work, or people that I'd worked with myself. And one has a huge sense of alienation and isolation from many years worth of friendships and partnerships in public engagement. And it is very difficult. But on this latest example that I've just given, it relates again to your question, Beverly. I mean, it's open to scrutiny, and we don't always agree. And the disagreement does not necessarily mean, and I'm glad that with this friend, it doesn't mean any hostility or anything. It means that we can use tools that we agree on, and we can apply them, and we don't necessarily yet at least agree. Perhaps we will resolve it and we will come to agreement.
Yes.
Perhaps we'll agree to disagree. But at least that is that kind of academic approach that John mentioned, the
Yes.
open approach, the democratic approach. And that's what we need to cherish and protect, because that's the big. There was a question before, what are the wider implications of the anti-Semitism? And they are partly because other groups can also be discriminated, but partly because the entire values of society as one where there is scrutiny of what is being said and what is being presented as facts is open to be contested, and so on. And that is what is eroding. And that's the big danger that I see once again.
Okay, I've got two more questions for you here in the comments, for you collectively. Have either of you picked up on the rhetorical strategy of extreme anti-Zionists in the UK attacking Germany's much stronger stance on the topic?
I think Germany's stronger stance on the topic is derived from the fact that, as I mentioned previously, their society has gone through an incredible destruction and trauma in the past, relating to a spasm of one of the most destructive spirals of anti-Semitism ever. So I think one of the reasons why Germany is quite strong on this topic is because of what Germany went through. And I think anti-Zionists generally are going to be quite opposed to any suggestion that their ideology is anti-Semitic. I will say, as Yaron said earlier, this seminar doesn't necessarily need to get into the question of, is anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism always the same thing. I personally would say that most of the time it is, with a few caveats. If someone's just generally against the idea of nationalism, right, then then they're against all nationalisms, including Zionism. That's one thing. It's always very strange when they start picking on Zionism first. If I'm an anti-nationalist and the only nationalism we need to get rid of is Zionism, of course that's picking on the Jewish example. So I would say that's anti-Semitic. But I think it's we do see anti-Zionists becoming more and more inflamed as it becomes, as more and more people discuss exactly what they're doing and the impact that's having on our society here in the UK. Because I don't think that anti-Zionism has really achieved much for Palestinians at all. I certainly don't think it's achieved much in the UK either. So scrutiny for their ideas is actually very important, because I think a lot of the time they do cross over into anti-Semitism.
Well, from the discursive perspective, I actually end the article, it's all about context, with a kind of a word of caution that there is a risk of using the term anti-Zionism, and I'm not saying that it was used like that here now, but there is a risk of using it in a way that is sort of parallel, the counterpart to the way Zionism is used in an undifferentiated way by opponents of Zionism, so that we kind of say everybody that we don't like, everybody who's an enemy, everybody who's evil, everybody who's no good is an anti-Zionist. Rather, we would need to, again, to be consistent with my method, one would have to take whatever it is that one denotes as anti-Zionism and pick the features. What are the features? What are the indicators that bring us to the conclusion that they are anti-Zionist? Is it their own self-proclaimed or whatever? But that aside, I identify with the question very strongly, not least because recently in conversation with a Palestinian friend whom I've known for many years and decades, he brought up the view that Germany's stance on Gaza in the developments of the past year reflects what he called a pathology. So it's a pathological kind of defense of Israel. And I responded by saying, well, if you call pathology a taboo on doing what people did in Germany for 1,000 years, which was bash Jews and justify pogroms and carry out pogroms, if that's a pathology of the taboo on doing and continuing to do what people did for 1,000 years, if that's a pathology, then it's a pathology that I welcome. That's a welcome change. But I know Germany very, very well. I didn't mention before, but I grew up in Israel mainly, and I left at a rather young age. I wasn't even 20 years old when I moved to Germany. I spent many years in Germany before then moving to the UK, and I'm back in Germany now, as I mentioned. So I know German society very, very well, I think. And I think that, that there's an even more fine-tuned aspect to it. I have witnessed 2 generations of German educators who worked tirelessly in schools and NGOs and institutions and media to educate about the dangers of Nazism and fascism and anti-Semitism, and so what John was pointing to before, there is a certain collective experience in the if you want to call it societal national consciousness of Germany. It is not a natural phenomenon. People did it. People are responsible for it in the positive way. People worked very, very hard to set up commemoration sites and education programs and so on. And I think that has borne fruit. We see a different climate in Germany now than we see in some other European countries. Particularly, I would single out the UK and France, but also Spain and Italy, and sadly also Australia and the US to some extent. We really do see a different public climate. That is not to say that we don't find some extremist position, and there is also attack, and there's anti-Semitism, and there's violent anti-Semitism, and the need for protection, and all of those things. But that's been the case also for years. It's not new. And there are debates, and sometimes people get things wrong. Let me just give an example. There were debates here in Germany a few months ago about the uninviting of speakers to public events at universities. And I'd like to give just 2 examples. There was a case of the philosopher Nancy Fraser, who was uninvited from a conference or an event at the University of Cologne because she had signed something authored by others, which, among other things, called Israel's actions in Gaza genocide. She was uninvited. And then Judith Butler, another American philosopher, was also uninvited from a different event because she herself had actually called Hamas part of the resistance, which we need to stand by, broadly speaking. I'm not sure that those were her exact words, but basically we need to side with Hamas and Hezbollah because they are part of the resistance.
She called them a progressive force for social justice.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. That's quite right. Thank you. Yes, so that's more than just resistance. Absolutely. I that phrase escaped me, maybe because it was so unimaginable. But yes, indeed. So I differentiate between the two. Both were uninvited. And I think that I would not have uninvited Nancy Fraser. And I support the people. There was some opposition to that. And some people actually approached me. I didn't sign anything, but I gave them kind of my blessing for what it's worth. I said, I agree with them. But I would have uninvited Judith Butler, and I think it's a very interesting comparison because they're both in many ways in the same category. They are feminist philosophers, Americans, and so on and so forth, who wrote about human rights. So they're as similar as two different people can get, perhaps in that respect. And the point is that if you want to be sensibly and in a sensitive way manage these things, these are at the end of the day administrative decisions, and sometimes you get them wrong because we don't have a template for everything. There's no ready-made template for exactly who do you uninvite in such situations, and sometimes people get things wrong, and that's why it should be open to debate. But generally, there is that sensitivity in Germany that I do not see in Britain, and that is scary.
Okay, I've got many questions building up here. Yes. First of all, the person asking this question says, but please don't respond to this. I'm just going to point this out, that you actually missed the fact that this was not about Germany per se, but it was about the fact that people in the UK, such as the lovely Owen Jones, are condemning Germany, as disgusting and so on. Condemning the German stance, progressive stance, as disgusting. So just to note, this is what's happening in Britain in respect to the German stance. But I'm not going to, because I want to move on to several other people here. First of all, going back to your use of the word innocent, somebody's commenting, in the context of the MP, that the word innocent is often used to imply that somebody else, not necessarily the perpetrator, is not innocent. Oh, I'm sorry for the innocent ones, implying, oh yes, what about all those other Israelis in this context? Yes. And related to this, the comment that so much of the discourse is constructed around plausible deniability. And something else from the same person. I used to suggest that people meant the Israeli government or a particular segment of Zionist opinion when they referred to Jews in many of these conversations. Eventually, I realized that in most cases they were saying exactly what they meant the first time, and such advice merely enabled them to dog whistle. Do you want to elaborate on that? Question asker? No, okay. I'll read that again. I used to suggest that people meant the Israeli government or a particular segment of Zionist opinion when they referred to Jews in many of these conversations. So when they say Jew, they really meant the government, something like that. Eventually, I realized that in most cases they were saying exactly what they meant the first time, and such advice or merely enabled them to dog whistle.
I think a lot of the time there's a problem of people not actually understanding the meaning of words, because I think if you go to anti-Zionists in general, a group of 10 or 100 anti-Zionists, and try and ask for them to define the word Zionism, I think you might get a lot of different answers, and many of those answers might not be even at all coherent. I think something Yaron was saying earlier about someone asking him if he was a Zionist, and then him replying with, well, what do you mean by Zionist? And the guy wouldn't give him a response. So I think the same thing applies to anti-Zionism and people who identify as anti-Zionism. A lot of the time, they don't even really know what it is that they're specifically opposing, or they might come out with some ludicrous nonsense. They might define being anti-Zionist as being against some great global conspiracy that they believe is happening. Or something I've seen quite a lot of times is that anti-Zionists define Zionism as ethnic cleansing, right? Inherently, Israel is ethnic cleansing. Yes. So therefore, by being anti-Zionist, we're not even opposing Jewish self-determination. What we're opposing is ethnic cleansing. So I think what we actually need, as much as anything else, and this is why Yaron's work is very important, is we need consistency and standards in defining words. I think that needs to be an important part of the methodology, is defining things clearly, so that we know what we're talking about when we're having these debates.
But now you're behaving, oh sorry, you're speaking as if these people really wanted to have clear content.
Well, that's why I invoked Jean-Paul Sartre, because a lot of the time it's
Exactly, that's what I meant.
intent.
You're going back on the fact what you were saying earlier. They're not after clarity.
But we are. So that's why we need to bring clarity and standards.
And that's what I called before illocutionary inversion.
Exactly.
So there's an illocution that purports to be presenting information and categorizing it, but actually what it's doing, it's saying, I'm on this side, and either you join me or I don't want to talk to you. And that's where we have a conflict of intent here around the mere communication. I just a quick remark on the word innocent, without going back to the thing. I think to the actual statement and what it was there, because we don't all have it in front of us. But I think that's exactly the point. So my point about the methodical approach to the words and context is that, I mentioned the innocent was there, and there's another way to look at it, and there are other possible interpretations of the word innocent. Is it there in opposition? My view, for example, is when the person said, Israeli and foreign citizens were killed, and then in the next sentence, Israel is committing massacres. This is on the day where we want to commemorate the Hamas massacre, but the massacre is actually assigned and attributed to Israel, not to Hamas. And the Israelis were killed. But the Israelis and foreign citizens, it's true. It's a fact that foreign citizens or non-Israeli citizens were also murdered on that day. That is a fact. But one could just as much see that it's an attempt to say to particular voters from whom one expects to be anti-Israel, don't worry that I'm mentioning the Israelis, I'm also mentioning the foreigners. So I'm commemorating this day and on the anniversary, not because I'm sympathetic to the Israelis, but because there were also foreigners that were killed. So there's various interpretations. But as I was saying before, a friend of mine and I are arguing about this, and that's exactly the method. And that's an acceptable method of arguing, because we take, okay, what are possible interpretations? That applies to the word innocent in that statement as well.
Okay, somebody's pointed out to me that my microphone is still very bad. So I'm wondering whether Martine could take over for the last 10 minutes in terms of chairing and looking at the chat box. Can you do that, Martine?
Or otherwise, we can perhaps encourage people to just raise their hand and talk to us before, as Becky did, and then
True.
we can, if we can take, perhaps, if you agree, if we can take any comments or questions that remain in that way, then that would make it easier. Use the what's it called? The Zoom raise your hand function. If you
The raise your hand function is under reactions. Okay, well, I do have another question here in the comments. I'm trying to get as close to my microphone as I can. I'm going to read this out. Much of the time, the discourse is premised on an assumption that Jews, or those considered sympathetic to Jews, are engaged in trickery. So the anti-Semite tries to be, in their mind, cleverer. That's true, but it's funny. Beg your pardon.
Well, I think that's a well-known trope, and I don't know that we need to. I don't have any comment on, except that yes, indeed.
It's an interesting idea. It's a sort of they would I guess they would maybe think of themselves as engaging in some mirroring, but what they're actually mirroring is something that is false. This is why a lot of the time you see in these sorts of spaces people are engaging in projection. And maybe this is the I'm being highly speculative here, but maybe this is the source of some of the projection, that you falsely identify things in the group that you're trying to oppose, and then you see that as a way to as something justified that you can do in reverse, right? So I think it's quite a dangerous mindset, because I would say that sounds quite escalatory to me.
Well, but actually, it's there all the time, and that actually, coming back to our point, can we use context to interpret and identify and diagnose anti-Semitism? It's something that I personally struggled with for decades. I spent 25 years at a British university, and if you know British universities, you know that they're full of metrics and indicators and for everything, whether it's for a pay rise or promotion or even just passing, whatever. You're all the time under scrutiny with points allocated for how much you've published and how much you got in grant money and how many students you've had and how much time you spent doing this and that. And I, I don't want to brag, but I was good. I passed all the, what do they call key performance indicators. I was, very high on all. And I was constantly confronted again and again and again with this kind of suspicion. Something that I'm doing, I'm trying to undermine the university from within. I'm doing something that's not that. And every move you make in the university in the UK nowadays is scrutinized by so many departments. You can't set up a computer without some kind of IT thing. You can't go an interview without an ethics approval. Every bus ticket needs to be submitted if you're claiming expense. All of that. It's a very tightly structured enterprise. But there was always this accompanying thing, not among everybody, of course, but among, all too often, more often than to be coincidence. There's something treacherous. There's something sinister. There's something diabolical about how I'm scheming. And at the end, that actually led me to leave in 2020, among other things. I've written about this partly in my last chapter in my latest book. I also deal, you mentioned that subtitle is Multilingualism, Decoloniality, and the Civic University. And the Civic University part deals with how difficult it is actually to be civic and in a genuine way and to do decoloniality in the universities the way they're set up. But it has many aspects, and it's not just anti-Semitism, but there was a component there. And it took me years, and not until I actually left my post that I was able to call it out. Because every time I tried to call it out internally, and I never made a formal complaint or anything like that, but I tried to deal with it in conversation, I was always reprimanded. You're the one who's causing here bad vibes because you're claiming there's anti-Semitism. And that means because nobody ever came to me in all those years in the university and said, "You Jew, get out." And since that wasn't the case, there was nothing tangible supposedly that I could present because nobody was open to the kind of contextual analysis that I'm advocating for today. So I experienced that personally, and if I did, dozens and hundreds and many more people have, I'm sure. On this sad note, yeah.
Yes, two more. Somebody's pointing out, which I think we would all agree on. I was always told Zionism means homeland for Jews, nothing more or less. And somebody, a rather large thing to introduce at the 11th hour, I would like to discuss the use of the concept of genocide in the actual discussion. And I'll just read another question. What if the context is the society in its anti-Semitic conditions? Oh, sorry. And its anti-Semitic conditions, how to get it in the discourse analysis? What if the context is a society in its anti-Semitic conditions, how to get that into the discourse analysis? Sorry, there's three things all together now.
Yeah, well, I said at the beginning, I'm not going to comment on, Zionism, anti-Semitism, and so on. I have my views. They can be read on another occasion, perhaps. But the concept of genocide, absolutely relevant. I don't think we have time to go in detail, but I would say at the same level as apartheid, Zionism, the other terms that were decontextualized, I would just say that there's a lot in the past year of genocide being simply a rant, an emotive rant. Now, of course, genocide is technically open to scrutiny because it's a legal category, and apartheid is as well. I think in some contexts there is some kind of international legal thing about what is apartheid, but certainly genocide, and it is being debated now. Whether we can trust the forums in which it is being debated or not is a different question, but there is that kind of legal definition of what it is.
Well, it is a crime of intent.
There will be a verdict, but what we see in the discussion is that genocide is being thrown around independently of whether the legal conditions for genocide are met or not. And again, people are saying, again, academics and others are saying, if you don't agree to that it's genocide, then I don't need to talk to you at all. So they're basically saying we don't need, we are canceling the whole procedure of scrutiny, of legal scrutiny of the preconditions, and we're taking that information category, supposedly legal category, supposedly, and using it simply to as an emotive rant. And that's exactly the elocutionary inversion that I was referring to before. So it fits perfectly into that framework. And otherwise, if the society is anti-Semitic, then part of the discourse context is the anti-Semitic context. I don't know what more. I mean, what we don't have there, if the whole society is inherently anti-Semitic, is the context or the values to which we can appeal to cancel the anti-Semitism, and that's the problem. But the contextual analysis remains in terms of the methods that I was introducing. That's my view on that.
I've always had a little bit of a fundamental issue with labeling an entire society as anything particularly.
Yes.
I think that these are actions of individuals and of groups, and there will always be outliers within society. Even if society is 80% racist against the group, right? There's still a 20% of people who, many of them probably think that some form of racism is completely disgusting. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of that sort of labeling. In terms of genocide, yeah, it's a term with a legal definition, right? So you have to be clear, you have to be specific, you have to talk about facts. And you have to investigate both the the claim and the context, and that's how you get to the bottom of these issues. I think it is being used as a kind of almost like a slur. It's kind of unfortunately using it in this very unrestrained way strips it of its very specific meaning, because there is a very clear legal definition to what genocide is, right? Words do have meanings. Words do have meanings. Reality is a thing, and we have, when we use words, we should be very careful and specific with how we use them. Whether that's genocide, whether that's apartheid, we use it as a as a term grounded in reality. Don't just use it as this emotive weapon. It's like it becomes weaponized. You know what I mean?
Yes, well, I'm going to have to draw this to a close. And thank you both very, very much. It's been very interesting, even though I feel it in a way we're almost just getting started at this point. But thank you, both of you, very much. And I'm sure we'll all be going away with the phrase illocutionary inversion on the tips of our tongues. Thank you.